All right, let's get into the first big idea from our source material. They call it a doctrine of division, and the core argument is pretty jarring. It's the idea that Jesus didn't come to bring peace, but actually to break society apart. And where does it start? At the very foundation, the family.
This verse from Luke is really the cornerstone of their whole argument. The source material looks at this and says, look, it's a direct, totally unambiguous statement of purpose. Not peace, but the exact opposite. And according to the specific interpretation, there's no wiggle room for metaphor. They take it at its word. And it doesn't stop there. The idea gets even more specific. They point to this verse from Matthew to argue that the division from Luke isn't just some general concept. Nope, it's aimed squarely at the family unit, literally pitting children against their parents and turning a household into a place of enemies. So, when you put those two verses together, the picture that emerges, at least according to this source, is of a figure whose whole mission seems to be undermining the most basic building blocks of society. And that's what they mean when they use this phrase, a weakener of nations.
Okay, so if you thought that was intense, the next part of the argument really ramps things up. It builds on that theme of division, but takes it to a whole other level. The source frames this next bit as a direct command, a mandate to hate, and they connect this directly to the behavior of what they call an abusive cult leader.
Just listen to how sweeping this is. The list is comprehensive. Father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters. But then it ends with the real bombshell. You also have to hate your own life. The source really hammers this point home. This isn't some casual suggestion. It's laid out as a hard and fast rule, a non-negotiable price of admission to be a disciple. And the source's take on this is blunt. They say this demand for complete rejection of your family and yourself is the classic playbook of a destructive cult. The whole point, they argue, is to cut you off from everything you know, making you totally and completely dependent on the leader.
Then, the source points out what it sees as a glaring contradiction. They put this instruction from the New Testament side by side with one of the 10 Commandments from the Old Testament. And it's pretty stark, right? One says, hate your parents. The other says, honor them.
Because of this head-on collision with established divine law, the source comes to a powerful conclusion. This isn't just a tough teaching, they say. It's an act of pure lawlessness. It essentially paints a picture of Jesus as someone actively dismantling the very laws he was supposed to fulfill.
All right, let's shift gears a bit. The next argument from the source isn't so much about theology. It's more about, well, just plain old common sense. They take a hard, practical look at that really famous parable of the lost sheep.
You know this story, right? We've all heard it. It's usually taught us this beautiful lesson about compassion and how every single person matters. But our source material asks us to just hit pause for a second and think about the actual logistics of what's happening here.
So according to the story itself, 99 sheep just get left behind. They're left out there in the wilderness, or in another version, in the mountains. Now, the source points out the obvious. These are not safe places. We're talking about leaving the entire flock totally vulnerable to predators, the elements, you name it.
And why? For just one sheep that wandered off. So the source basically asks a business question. From a pure risk management standpoint, does it make any sense to endanger 99% of your assets to maybe save 1%? So the conclusion they draw is that this isn't a story about a good shepherd at all. It's a story about a bad shepherd. It's a model for dangerous irresponsibility, a model where you risk the whole group for the sake of one, which could easily end with you losing everything.
Okay, for our final section, we're going to look at two more teachings that the source material flags as being, let's say, socially damaging. And in one case, the context around it is described as being pretty disturbing. Now, the source is really insistent on this point. They argue that this passage isn't a metaphor, it's not an analogy. It comes right after a conversation about how hard marriage can be, and it's presented as a literal statement. So, in their reading, this is being interpreted as a direct suggestion, self-mutilation as a way to get closer to God.
But what the source finds really unsettling is the sequence of events. Just think about the flow. Step 1, someone asks about marriage. Step 2, the response brings up self-castration. Step 3, literally in the very next moment, people bring little kids to be touched. The source argues that this progression is, well, at best, it's just bizarre, and at worst, it's deeply, deeply disturbing.
And finally,
Let's talk about one of the most famous lines in the entire Bible. You've heard it a million times. It's usually held up as this pillar of morality, right? A call for everyone to be tolerant and humble.
But, and you probably saw this coming, the source material sees it completely differently. They argue that banning judgment entirely is actually a recipe for societal collapse. Their point is that a healthy society has to make judgments about actions and behaviors. It's how you maintain order. If you take that away, they say, you just get a society of, well, their words, non-thinking automatons who just stand by and let evil happen without saying a word.
So let's take a breath. We've just walked through a pretty intense analysis from this source material. We've looked at familiar scriptures through a lens that focuses on things like division, control, what they call flawed logic, and teachings they see as morally corrosive.
Just to quickly recap the main points we covered, this specific interpretation we've been exploring claims that hidden within these texts are a doctrine of division, a command to hate your family and even yourself, the flawed logic of a bad shepherd, a shocking instruction for self-mutilation, and a ban on judgment that they believe would tear society apart.